One quiet afternoon in the park, a well-dressed black man sat on a bench, calmly reviewing his papers, but to a suspicious officer, his composure looked like a crime. What began as a simple question turned hostile, with insults, handcuffs, and humiliation. Hauled to the station, he was treated like a dangerous criminal, until his true identity came to light. And in that moment, the entire police department was shaken to its core. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of oak trees in Central Heights Park, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden bench, where Jonathan Williams sat with his usual quiet dignity. His eyes focused on the thick folder of documents spread across his lap. The afternoon sun warmed his shoulders as children's laughter echoed from the nearby playground. He adjusted his reading glasses and made careful notes in the margins of what appeared to be an important budget report. At 42, Jonathan carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who understood responsibility. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled from sitting, his tie loosened after what had clearly been a long day of important meetings. Despite his formal attire, there was something approachable about him as he occasionally glanced up to watch the families enjoying the park around him. The documents in his hands detailed renovation plans for this very park, new playground equipment, better lighting, expanded walking paths. Jonathan smiled softly as he reviewed the budget allocations, knowing these improvements would benefit the community he cared so deeply about. This peaceful moment, stolen between the demands of his professional life, reminded him exactly why his work mattered. Jonathan had no idea that just a short distance away, a police officer was already studying him with growing doubt. Officer Rick Davidson had been patrolling the Central Heights area for nearly 2 hours when he spotted the man sitting alone on the park bench. Something about the scene immediately caught his attention, and held it. A well-dressed black man in an expensive suit, sitting by himself in the middle of the afternoon, reading what looked like official documents. Rick slowed his patrol car and pulled over to get a better look. Through his windshield, Rick studied the figure more carefully. The man's clothing was too formal for a casual park visit. That suit probably cost more than Rick made in a month. Who wore a three-piece suit to sit in a park unless they were up to something? Rick's instincts, honed by 15 years on the force, were telling him this didn't add up. Rick stepped out of his patrol car, his hand instinctively adjusting his utility belt as he began walking toward the bench. The man hadn't even looked up when the police car arrived, which struck Rick as odd. Most people at least glanced over when law enforcement showed up, but this guy was acting like he belonged there, like he owned the place. Nobody dresses like that just to read in a park, Rick muttered under his breath, his suspicion growing with each step. Especially not around here. The expensive watch glinting on the man's wrist, the perfectly pressed shirt, the leather briefcase beside him, it all screamed money, and money in the wrong hands meant trouble in Rick's experience. As he got closer, Rick noticed how the man's eyes moved across the documents with practiced efficiency, like someone accustomed to handling important paperwork. That only made Rick more suspicious. Drug dealers had gotten sophisticated these days, carrying fake documents to throw off law enforcement. This guy was probably running numbers or coordinating some kind of operation, using the park as his office because he thought cops wouldn't bother him in such a public place. Rick was close enough now to see the man's face clearly. He looked to be in his 40s, well-groomed, with an air of confidence that immediately rubbed Rick the wrong way. There was something about the way he sat there, so calm and composed, that made Rick's gut tighten with suspicion. Unable to shake the growing distrust in his gut, Rick closed the distance and broke the silence. "Afternoon," Rick called out as he approached the bench, his tone carrying just enough authority to make his presence known. He kept his posture casual but alert, the way he'd been trained to approach potential suspects. Jonathan looked up from his documents, meeting Rick's eyes with a polite but guarded expression. He had been a black man in America long enough to recognize the particular way some police officers looked at him. That mixture of suspicion and barely concealed hostility that had nothing to do with anything he had done and everything to do with what he looked like. "Good afternoon," Officer Jonathan replied evenly, his voice calm and respectful despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. Rick stopped a few feet away from the bench, his eyes scanning the papers in Jonathan's lap and the expensive briefcase beside him. "Nice day to be out in the park," he said, though his tone suggested he found nothing nice about Jonathan's presence there. "It certainly is," Jonathan agreed, carefully closing the folder and setting it aside. He had learned long ago that sudden movements around suspicious police officers could escalate situations quickly. "Don't see many folks dressed up like you around these parts," Rick continued, his gaze lingering on Jonathan's suit with obvious skepticism. "You from around here?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both men understood perfectly. Jonathan felt that familiar weariness settle over him. The exhaustion that came from having to prove his right to exist in public spaces, to justify his presence simply because of the color of his skin. "I come here sometimes," Jonathan answered carefully, neither confirming nor denying Rick's assumption. "It's a peaceful place to think." Rick's eyes narrowed slightly. The man's evasiveness only confirmed his suspicions. "Think about what, exactly?" he pressed, taking a step closer. "Must be pretty important business to dress up like that for it." Jonathan could feel the conversation shifting, becoming more confrontational with each exchange. Rick's body language was growing more aggressive, his stance wider, his hand resting casually but meaningfully on his utility belt. This was the moment Jonathan had experienced too many times before, when a simple encounter with law enforcement began to transform into something potentially dangerous. "Just reviewing some work documents," Jonathan said, his voice remaining steady even as his heart rate increased. He gestured toward the closed folder. "Nothing that would interest you, officer. Why don't you let me be the judge of that?" Rick shot back, his mask of politeness finally slipping. "Seems funny to me that someone would come all the way out here in a $1,000 suit just to read papers. You sure you're not conducting some kind of business?" The word business came out with a particular emphasis that made Rick's assumptions crystal clear. Jonathan felt a familiar surge of anger mixed with resignation. Here it was again, the same tired script played out by different actors in different locations, but always with the same underlying theme. Again one more time, Jonathan thought to himself, the phrase echoing in his mind like a mantra of exhaustion. Jonathan could sense it, the officer's politeness was wearing thin, and the encounter was about to turn dangerous. Rick's patience was wearing thin. The man's calm demeanor and careful answers weren't fooling him one bit. In his experience, innocent people got nervous around cops, stumbled over their words, tried too hard to be helpful. This guy was too smooth, too composed. That meant he was hiding something. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Rick said, his voice shifting from conversational to authoritative. It wasn't a request anymore. It was a command. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He knew his rights, knew that he wasn't required to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. "May I ask what this is regarding, officer?" he asked carefully, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. "You may not," Rick snapped back, his tone growing harsher. "I'm conducting an investigation, and you fit the description of someone we're looking for. Now I can ask nicely, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." The lie came so easily to Rick that he almost believed it himself. There was no specific description, no ongoing investigation that Jonathan matched. But Rick had learned long ago that most people, especially people who looked like this man, would comply rather than challenge a police officer's authority. Jonathan's mind raced. He could feel the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Every instinct told him to assert his rights, to demand that Rick explain what crime he was suspected of committing. But every lesson learned from being a black man in America told him that challenging this officer could end very badly. "I haven't done anything wrong," Jonathan said quietly, his voice carrying both dignity and exhaustion. "I'm just sitting here reading." Rick stepped closer, close enough that Jonathan could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. "That's what they all say," Rick said with a sneer. "Look, friend, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know when someone doesn't belong somewhere, and I know when someone's lying to me." The word friend dripped with sarcasm and contempt. Rick's hand moved to rest on the grip of his service weapon, not drawing it, but making sure Jonathan could see it. The gesture was clear: comply or face the consequences. "I will be the one who decides whether you're suspicious or not," Rick continued, his voice growing louder and attracting the attention of nearby families. "Now show me your identification immediately, or you're going to find yourself face down on that bench with handcuffs on." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. The threat was explicit now, hanging in the air between them like a loaded gun. Around them, other park visitors were beginning to notice the confrontation. A jogger slowed down to watch. A mother pulled her children closer. The peaceful afternoon had transformed into a public spectacle. Rick saw the audience gathering and felt a surge of power. He was in control here, and everyone could see it. This well-dressed man who thought he could waltz into their neighborhood and conduct whatever business he was conducting was about to learn a lesson about respect for authority. "Last chance," Rick said, his voice carrying across the park. "ID now, or we're going to have a problem." Jonathan looked around at the faces watching them, saw the mix of curiosity, concern, and judgment in their eyes. He thought about his daughter Maya, about what she would say if she saw her father being humiliated like this in public. He thought about all the young black men who had found themselves in similar situations and hadn't walked away. His hands trembling slightly with suppressed anger and fear, Jonathan slowly reached into his jacket pocket for his wallet. With the officer's ultimatum hanging in the air, Jonathan forced his trembling hand toward his pocket, every movement heavy with risk. The moment Jonathan's hand moved toward his jacket, Rick's entire body tensed, his fingers instinctively tightening around his weapon's grip. "Slow," Rick barked. "Real slow, keep your other hand where I can see it." Jonathan's movements became deliberately measured, almost he had done this dance before, knew that any sudden motion could be interpreted as aggressive, could give Rick the excuse he seemed to be looking for. The wallet came out inch by inch, Jonathan's other hand raised slightly in a gesture of non-threatening compliance. "There," Jonathan said softly, extending the leather billfold toward Rick. "My identification." But even as he handed over the wallet, Jonathan felt something breaking inside him. Not the sharp crack of sudden trauma, but the slow grinding erosion of dignity that came from being forced to prove his right to exist in a public space. This was the tax he paid for being black in America. The constant requirement to submit, to placate, to make others comfortable with his presence. Rick snatched the wallet and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the driver's license with practiced efficiency. The name meant nothing to him, but that wasn't the point. The point was power, control, the ability to make this man jump through hoops simply because Rick wore a badge. As Rick examined the ID, Jonathan's mind wandered to places he tried not to go. He thought about Philando Castile, reaching for his wallet during a traffic stop. He thought about Oscar Grant, lying face down on a subway platform. He thought about all the names that had become hashtags, all the lives that had ended in moments just like this one. But mostly he thought about Maya, his brilliant, fierce 16-year-old daughter who believed her father could fix anything, who saw him as her hero. What would she think if she walked into this park right now and saw him being treated like a common criminal? How would he explain to her that sometimes, even when you've done everything right, even when you've worked twice as hard and achieved twice as much, you still have to bow your head and submit to someone else's prejudices? The internal struggle was exhausting. Part of him wanted to stand up, to tell Rick exactly who he was, to watch the color drain from the officer's face when he realized his mistake. But the wiser part of him, the part that had kept him alive through 42 years of navigating a world that often saw him as a threat first and a human being second, told him to stay quiet, to endure, to live to fight another day. "You live at this address?" Rick asked, his tone suggesting he found something suspicious about Jonathan's upscale neighborhood. "Yes sir," Jonathan replied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. He hated the deference in his own voice, hated that he felt compelled to add the sir like some kind of verbal genuflection. Rick studied the license for a long moment, clearly hoping to find some discrepancy, some reason to escalate further. When he found nothing obvious, his frustration was palpable. "What kind of work do you do?" he pressed. Jonathan hesitated. The truth would end this immediately, but it would also reinforce everything wrong with the situation. His identity shouldn't matter. A homeless man should have the same right to read in this park that he did. But the exhaustion was overwhelming, and the weight of all those watching eyes was becoming unbearable. "I work in city government," Jonathan said carefully, choosing his words to be truthful without being specific. The answer only seemed to make Rick more suspicious. "City government," he repeated, as if the words themselves were evidence of criminal activity. Doing what exactly? Before Jonathan could fully respond, Rick's impatience snapped, and the situation lurched towards something far more dangerous. Before Jonathan could answer, Rick's radio crackled to life with a routine dispatch call. Rick ignored it, his focus entirely on the man in front of him. The power dynamic had shifted completely now. Rick was in control, and he was enjoying every minute of it. "Stand up," Rick commanded suddenly, his voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. "I need to search you." Jonathan's heart sank. "Officer, I don't understand. What crime am I suspected of committing?" "Suspicious behavior in a public area," Rick replied curtly, though they both knew it wasn't a real charge. "Failure to cooperate with a police investigation. Now stand up, or I'll make you stand up." The families around them had stopped pretending not to watch. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, asking questions in hushed voices. A mother hurriedly gathered her toddler, and moved to a bench farther away, casting nervous glances over her shoulder. The peaceful park had transformed into a theater of injustice, with Jonathan as the unwilling star. Jonathan rose slowly from the bench, his dignity intact, but his spirit breaking with each passing second. "This is unnecessary, officer. I've done nothing wrong. Turn around, hands behind your back." The words hit Jonathan like physical blows. He looked around desperately, hoping anyone would intervene. But the other park visitors just watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, the way people watch a car accident, unable to look away but unwilling to get involved. "Please," Jonathan said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Don't do this. Not here. Not in front of these children." But Rick was already pulling out his handcuffs, the metal gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The sound of the cuffs clicking open seemed to echo across the entire park. "Sir, what did that man do?" a small voice asked from somewhere nearby. Jonathan turned slightly, and saw a little girl, maybe 7 years old, tugging on her mother's sleeve. The child's face was filled with genuine confusion and concern. Her mother, a young black woman, looked horrified as she recognized what was unfolding before them. "Nothing, baby," the mother whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "He didn't do anything wrong." Those words, spoken by a stranger who understood exactly what was happening, nearly broke Jonathan's composure entirely. Here was someone who saw the truth of the situation, who recognized the injustice for what it was. But even her witness, even her understanding, couldn't stop what was about to happen. Rick grabbed Jonathan's wrists roughly, forcing them behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Jonathan's skin as Rick tightened them more than necessary. "You're under arrest for suspicious behavior and interfering with a police investigation," Rick announced loudly, ensuring everyone in the vicinity could hear. Jonathan said nothing as Rick pushed him toward the patrol car. The weight of the handcuffs, the stares of the onlookers, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of families and children. It all pressed down on him like a crushing weight. As they walked past the young mother and her daughter, Jonathan caught the woman's eye. In that brief moment, he saw his own pain reflected back at him, along with an understanding that transcended words. She knew, they all knew, but knowing wasn't enough to stop it. The weight of the handcuffs and the silent judgment of the crowd followed Jonathan into the harsh fluorescent glare of the police station. The fluorescent lights of the Central Heights police station buzzed overhead as Rick marched Jonathan through the main entrance. The familiar sounds of police work filled the air, ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and the low murmur of officers going about their daily routines. But as Jonathan was led through the bullpen, those sounds began to fade into an uncomfortable silence. Officer Martinez looked up from his paperwork and did a double take. His pen froze mid-sentence as recognition flickered across his face. For a moment, his eyes met Jonathan's, and Jonathan could see the shock and confusion there. Martinez quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in his reports, but his hands were trembling slightly as he tried to continue writing. At the booking desk, Sergeant Williams glanced up from her computer screen, and her expression immediately changed. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she was about to say something, but then she caught sight of Jonathan's subtle shake of the head. Barely perceptible, but clear enough. The message was unmistakable: say nothing. Not yet. The silence in the station was becoming oppressive. Other officers who had been chatting moments before found sudden urgent business at their desks. Detective Rodriguez, who had been walking toward the coffee machine, abruptly changed direction and disappeared into an interview room. The atmosphere was thick with tension and unspoken recognition. Rick, oblivious to the change in mood around him, continued his routine. "Need to process this one," he announced to Sergeant Williams, his voice carrying the self-satisfaction of a job well done. "Suspicious behavior in Central Heights Park, wouldn't cooperate with questioning." Sergeant Williams' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had worked with Jonathan on several community policing initiatives. She knew exactly who was standing in front of her booking desk in handcuffs, and the sight made her stomach turn. But Jonathan's eyes met hers again, and that same silent message passed between them. "I'll handle the paperwork," she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. Officer Chen, walking past with a cup of coffee, stumbled slightly when he saw Jonathan. The coffee sloshed in his mug, and he had to grab onto a nearby desk to steady himself. His face went pale as he processed what he was seeing, and he quickly hurried away without making eye contact with anyone. The weight of all these silent recognitions was crushing. Jonathan could feel the discomfort radiating from every officer in the room, could see the way they avoided looking directly at him while stealing glances when they thought Rick wasn't watching. These were people he had worked with. People who knew his reputation, his character, his position in the community, and yet none of them could speak up, none of them could intervene. Lieutenant Harris emerged from his office and stopped dead in his tracks. His face cycled through a range of emotions: surprise, horror, and something that looked almost like fear. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it and retreated back into his office, closing the door with more force than necessary. Rick was beginning to sense that something was off. The station was too quiet, the other officers too carefully focused on their work, but his pride and his conviction that he had done the right thing kept him from questioning the strange atmosphere. Jonathan stood silently in the middle of it all, watching the faces of people who knew the truth but felt powerless to act on it. And then came the voice that would shatter Rick's illusion of control, echoing down the hallway before its owner even appeared. The heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway announced Captain Sarah Thompson's approach before she came into view. She had been in her office reviewing case files when the unusual quiet in the bullpen caught her attention. 23 years of police work had taught her to recognize when something was wrong, and the atmosphere in her station was definitely wrong. As she rounded the corner and saw the scene at the booking desk, Captain Thompson stopped so abruptly that she nearly stumbled. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the sight of Jonathan Williams, Mayor Jonathan Williams, standing in handcuffs in the middle of her police station. "What in the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Rick turned toward his captain, his chest puffed out with pride. "Captain Thompson, I've apprehended a suspect who was engaging in suspicious behavior in Central Heights Park. He was uncooperative during questioning and failed to provide adequate explanation for his presence in the area." Captain Thompson's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then something approaching horror. She looked from Rick to Jonathan, then back to Rick again, as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. "Officer Davidson," she said slowly, her voice dangerously quiet, "do you have any idea who this man is?" Rick's confident demeanor began to waver slightly. The captain's tone was not what he had expected. Where was the congratulations for his thorough police work? Where was the approval for his vigilant attention to suspicious activity? "No, ma'am," Rick replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. He claimed to work in city government, but he was evasive when I pressed for details. Given his behavior and his presence in an area where we've had reports of drug activity, I felt it was appropriate to bring him in for further questioning. The silence that followed Rick's explanation was deafening. Captain Thompson closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for what she had to do next. When she opened them, her expression was a mixture of professional composure and barely contained fury. "Officer Davidson," she said, each word precisely enunciated, "you have just arrested Mayor Jonathan Williams." The words hit Rick like a physical blow. His face went completely white, the color draining from it so quickly that several officers later said they thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. "I'm sorry, what?" Rick finally managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "Mayor Jonathan, Williams, Captain Thompson repeated, her voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each word. The man you have handcuffed at my booking desk is the mayor of this city. Rick's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he had to grab onto the edge of the booking desk to steady himself. His eyes darted frantically between Captain Thompson and Jonathan, searching for some sign that this was a mistake, some indication that he hadn't just committed the most catastrophic error of his career. But Rick stammered, his usual confidence completely evaporated. He was acting suspicious. He didn't say, if he's the mayor, why didn't he just tell me? Jonathan spoke for the first time since entering the station, his voice calm and dignified despite the circumstances. I shouldn't have to announce my title to justify my right to sit in a public park, Officer Davidson. The simple statement landed with devastating impact. Rick's face crumpled as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. He had arrested the mayor of the city that employed him, that paid his salary, that trusted him to serve and protect its citizens. Captain Thompson moved quickly to take control of the situation. Sergeant Williams, remove those handcuffs immediately, she ordered. Lieutenant Harris, I need you to clear this area, everyone else back to work. Now. The station erupted into motion as officers scrambled to look busy, but the tension remained thick in the air. Rick stood frozen, watching as Jonathan's handcuffs were removed, seeing the red marks they had left on the mayor's wrists. Mayor Williams, Captain Thompson said, her voice filled with genuine remorse. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this situation. This is absolutely unacceptable, and I assure you that there will be a full investigation into Officer Davidson's conduct. Jonathan rubbed his wrists gently, restoring circulation to his hands. He looked at Rick, who appeared to be in a state of shock, then back at Captain Thompson. Captain, I appreciate your concern, Jonathan said quietly. But this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers to target citizens based on assumptions and prejudices, rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. Rick finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Sir, Mr. Mayor, I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, officer. Jonathan replied, his tone patient but firm. You didn't know, but you acted anyway. You made assumptions about who I was and what I was doing based solely on what I looked like. The silence of the station gave way to whispers across the city, and within 72 hours, those whispers became a formal inquiry. 3 days later, the conference room at Central Heights Police Station felt smaller than usual, packed with officials who rarely found themselves in the same space. The mahogany table was surrounded by internal affairs investigators, union representatives, department heads, and city officials. At the head of the table sat Chief of Police Robert Hayes, his weathered face grave with the weight of the situation they were addressing. Rick Davidson sat at the far end of the table, his usual confidence completely absent. His uniform, normally pressed to perfection, looked wrinkled and worn. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much since the incident. His hands, clasped tightly in his lap, trembled slightly as he waited for the proceedings to begin. This disciplinary hearing is now in session, Chief Hayes announced, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in law enforcement. We are here to address the incident involving Officer Richard Davidson and Mayor Jonathan Williams that occurred on Tuesday afternoon at Central Heights Park. Jonathan sat directly across from Rick, his presence commanding even in the sterile conference room. Unlike the casual attire he had worn in the park, he was now dressed in his official capacity, a perfectly tailored navy suit that spoke of authority and professionalism. But it was his composure that was most striking. While everyone else in the room seemed tense and uncomfortable, Jonathan appeared calm and focused. Internal Affairs Director Linda Martinez opened the case file and began reading. Officer Davidson, you are facing charges of misconduct, abuse of authority, racial profiling, and violation of civil rights. These are serious allegations that could result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. Rick's face went pale at the word termination. His career, his pension, his entire identity was tied up in this job. The thought of losing it all made him physically sick. Officer Davidson, Chief Hayes continued, please explain to this board your justification for approaching Mayor Williams in the park. Rick cleared his throat nervously, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Sir, I observed a subject who I believed was acting suspiciously. He was well dressed in an area where we've had reports of drug activity, and his behavior seemed inconsistent with normal park usage." "What specifically about his behavior was suspicious?" Director Martinez asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In the harsh light of the conference room, with all eyes on him, his reasoning sounded flimsy even to himself. He was sitting alone, reading documents. It seemed unusual for someone to be dressed so formally in a park setting. A heavy silence filled the room. Several board members exchanged glances, the absurdity of the explanation hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Captain Thompson, who had been observing quietly, leaned forward. "Officer Davidson, are you saying that being well dressed in a public park constitutes suspicious behavior?" "No, ma'am, not exactly," Rick stammered. It was the combination of factors. The expensive clothing, the documents he was reading, the way he seemed to be conducting business. "What business?" Director Martinez interrupted. "According to your report, you never observed Mayor Williams interact with anyone else. He was sitting alone, reading." Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had no answer because there was no answer. His entire justification had been built on assumptions and prejudices that couldn't survive scrutiny. Jonathan had remained silent throughout Rick's testimony, but now he asked permission to speak. "May I address the board?" Chief Hayes nodded. "Please, Mayor Williams." Jonathan stood, his movements deliberate and dignified. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and the authority of his office. "Members of the board, I want to be clear about something from the outset. This incident is not about me personally. Yes, I was the victim of Officer Davidson's actions, but I am not here seeking personal vindication or revenge. I am here because what happened to me happens to countless black men and women every day across this country, and they don't have the protection of a title or position to shield them." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Officer Davidson made a series of decisions that day, each one building on assumptions that had nothing to do with my actual behavior, and everything to do with his preconceived notions about black men in public spaces. He saw me reading documents, and assumed I was conducting illegal business. He saw my clothing, and assumed it was evidence of criminal activity rather than professional responsibility. He saw my composure and interpreted it as evasiveness rather than dignity." Rick slouched further in his chair with each point Jonathan made, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. "But here's what troubles me most," Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger. "Even when I complied with every request, even when I remained respectful and non-confrontational, Officer Davidson continued to escalate the situation. He was determined to find criminality where none existed because he had already decided who I was based on what I looked like." Union Representative James Miller, who had been taking notes furiously, looked up. "Mayor Williams, with all due respect, Officer Davidson was following his training. Police officers are taught to be observant, to notice unusual patterns of behavior." Jonathan turned his attention to Miller, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Mr. Miller, what training teaches an officer that reading in a park is suspicious behavior? What protocol justifies handcuffing a man who has committed no crime, violated no law, and posed no threat to anyone?" Miller had no response. The union's typical defenses seemed inadequate in the face of Jonathan's calm logic. Director Martinez consulted her notes. "Officer Davidson, you stated in your report that Mayor Williams fit the description of a suspect. Can you elaborate on that?" Rick's face flushed red. This was the moment he had been dreading. "Ma'am, there wasn't a specific bolo or anything like that. It was more of a general profile we had been told to watch for." "A general profile?" Chief Hayes asked, his tone sharpening. "What exactly does that mean?" The room waited as Rick struggled to find words that wouldn't damn him completely. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Black male, well-dressed, possibly conducting business in public areas." The silence that followed was deafening. Board members stared at Rick in disbelief. Even his own union representative looked horrified. "Officer Davidson," Chief Hayes said slowly, "are you telling this board that you arrested Mayor Williams based on his race and the fact that he was well-dressed?" Rick's world was collapsing around him. "No sir, that's not, I mean, there were other factors," What other factors? Director Martinez demanded. Rick searched desperately for something, anything, that might justify his actions. He seemed too calm. Most people get nervous around police, but he was too composed. It seemed unnatural. Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. Unnatural. Officer Davidson, I was calm because I've been in situations like this before. I was calm because I knew that any sign of agitation or frustration could be interpreted as aggression. I was calm because 42 years of being a black man in America has taught me that survival sometimes depends on not giving officers like you an excuse to escalate. The power of Jonathan's words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Several board members visibly flinched at the raw truth he had just spoken. You want to know why I didn't immediately announce that I was the mayor? Jonathan continued, his voice rising slightly for the first time. Because my title shouldn't matter. A homeless man should have the same right to read in that park that I do. A teenager should be able to sit on a bench without being harassed. The fact that I'm the mayor might protect me from the consequences of your officers' actions, but it doesn't make those actions any less wrong. Rick buried his face in his hands. The full weight of what he had done was finally sinking in, and it was crushing him. Chief Hayes addressed the room. Are there any other questions for Officer Davidson? Board member Dr. Patricia Williams, a community representative, raised her hand. Officer Davidson, in your 15 years of service, how many white men have you arrested for reading in parks? Rick looked up, his face streaked with tears he didn't remember shedding. Ma'am, it's a simple question. How many white men have you found suspicious for being well-dressed and reading documents in public spaces? Rick's silence was answer enough. Jonathan spoke once more, his voice returning to its earlier calm. I don't say this to be vindictive, but Officer Davidson's actions represent a systemic problem that goes far beyond one man's prejudices. This department, like many others across the country, needs to examine how implicit bias affects policing decisions. It needs to ask itself whether it's truly serving all citizens equally. He looked directly at Rick, who couldn't meet his eyes. I don't harbor personal animosity toward Officer Davidson, but I do expect this department to take meaningful action to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. The hearing continued for another hour, with testimony from witnesses and character references. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Rick's own words had sealed his fate. As the proceedings concluded, and the board prepared to deliberate, Rick finally found the courage to look at Jonathan directly. Mayor Williams, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I'm sorry, I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Jonathan studied Rick's face for a long moment, seeing the genuine remorse there. Officer Davidson, I accept your apology, but apologies aren't enough. Change is what's needed, real systematic change. As the room emptied out, Jonathan remained seated, lost in thought. The victory felt hollow somehow. Justice for him was assured by his position and influence, but what about all the others who didn't have such protection? What about the next black man who would find himself in Rick Davidson's crosshairs? The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the consequences of that afternoon in Central Heights Park rippled outward, far beyond the walls of the police station. 2 weeks after the disciplinary hearing, the news broke across every major outlet in the city. Police officer terminated for arresting mayor, in Park read the headlines, but Jonathan knew the real story was more complex than any newspaper could capture in a single headline. Rick Davidson cleaned out his desk on a gray Thursday morning, his 15-year career reduced to a cardboard box of personal items and a final paycheck. The other officers watched him leave with a mixture of sympathy and relief. Sympathy for a colleague whose career had ended in disgrace, relief that the embarrassing incident was finally behind them. But for Jonathan, Rick's termination was just the first step in a much larger process. The real work was about to begin. The following Monday, Jonathan stood before the city council in the packed chambers of City Hall. The room buzzed with energy as citizens, police officers, activists, and media representatives filled every available seat. This was the moment he had been preparing for since that afternoon in Central Heights Park. My fellow citizens, Jonathan began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's sound system. 2 weeks ago, I experienced something that happens far too often in our community and communities across America. I was racially profiled, arrested, and humiliated by a member of our own police force for the crime of reading in a public park while black. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in recognition, having experienced similar treatment themselves. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But I'm not here today to relitigate that incident, or to seek sympathy for what I endured. I'm here to announce a comprehensive reform initiative that will ensure what happened to me never happens to anyone else in our city. Jonathan outlined his plan with the precision and passion that had made him an effective leader. The Police Accountability and Community Trust Act would mandate implicit bias training for all officers, establish an independent oversight committee with real investigative power, and create new protocols for police interactions with citizens. We're also launching the Community Bridge program, Jonathan continued, which will place social workers and mental health professionals alongside police officers on certain calls, reducing the likelihood of unnecessary confrontations and arrests. In the audience, Captain Sarah Thompson listened intently. She had initially been resistant to outside oversight of her department, but the incident with Jonathan had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture she had helped create. Now she found herself nodding along with the mayor's proposals. Change is never easy, Jonathan acknowledged, his gaze sweeping across the diverse crowd. It requires us to examine our assumptions, challenge our biases, and admit when we've fallen short of our ideals. But change is also necessary if we want to build a community where every person, regardless of race, economic status, or background, can feel safe and respected. The legislation passed the City Council by a vote of 7-2, with even some traditionally conservative members supporting the reforms. The local newspaper editorial board, initially skeptical of what they saw as knee-jerk reactions to an isolated incident, came around when they saw the thoughtful, comprehensive nature of Jonathan's proposals. 3 months later, the changes were already beginning to show results. Officer complaints dropped by 30% in the first quarter following implementation. Community trust surveys showed marked improvement, particularly in neighborhoods that had historically had tense relationships with law enforcement. Jonathan made it a point to visit Central Heights Park regularly, usually on the same afternoon when he had first encountered Rick Davidson. Sometimes he brought work with him, sometimes just a book for pleasure reading. Parents would occasionally approach him, thanking him for making their children's neighborhood safer. On one such afternoon, as autumn was painting the park's trees in brilliant oranges and golds, Jonathan noticed a familiar figure walking hesitantly down the path. Rick Davidson looked older, the confident swagger that had once defined him replaced by uncertain steps and hunched shoulders. Rick stopped about 20 feet away from Jonathan's bench, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. For several minutes, the two men simply acknowledged each other's presence without speaking. Finally, Rick approached. "Mayor Williams, I hope it's okay that I'm here. I don't want to disturb you or cause any trouble." Jonathan looked up from the community newsletter he had been reading. "It's a public park, Mr. Davidson. Everyone's welcome here." Rick managed a weak smile at the gentle irony in Jonathan's words. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything happened. I've been attending counseling sessions, trying to understand how I got so lost." "That takes courage," Jonathan replied, gesturing to the empty space on the bench beside him. "Would you like to sit?" Rick hesitated for a moment, then accepted the invitation. The two men sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching children play on the new playground equipment that had been installed as part of the park renovation project. "I see things differently now," Rick said quietly. "I mean, I always thought I wasn't racist, you know. I told myself I treated everyone the same. But when I really examined my actions, my assumptions, I had to admit I was wrong about a lot of things." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "Recognition is the first step toward change. The question is, what do you plan to do with that recognition?" Rick had been hoping for this conversation, had been preparing for it during weeks of soul-searching and therapy sessions. "I want to help, if you'll let me. I know I don't have any credibility left, but maybe that's exactly why my voice might matter. If someone like me, someone who made those mistakes, can speak to other officers about implicit bias and the harm it causes. Jonathan considered this proposal carefully. The idea of Rick Davidson becoming an advocate for police reform had a certain poetic justice to it, but Jonathan was cautious about anything that might come across as performative rather than genuine. It would have to be real, Jonathan said finally. Not just public relations or an attempt to rehabilitate your image, real commitment to change, real understanding of the harm that was done. I understand, Rick replied. I'm not looking for forgiveness or redemption. I'm looking for a way to make sure other officers don't make the same mistakes I did. As the sun began to set over Central Heights Park, the two men continued their conversation. It was tentative and careful, marked by the profound inequality of their positions. One a powerful elected official, the other a disgraced ex-cop trying to find a path forward. But it was also in its own way hopeful. Change, Jonathan reflected as he walked home that evening, rarely came in dramatic moments or sweeping declarations. More often, it came in small steps, difficult conversations, and the willingness of imperfect people to keep trying to do better. The reforms he had championed were making a difference, the data showed that clearly. But perhaps even more importantly, individuals were changing too. Officers were questioning assumptions they had never examined before. Citizens were engaging with their local government in new ways, and occasionally, former adversaries were finding ways to work together toward a common goal. Real change begins when we learn to see each other through our hearts, not through our prejudices, Jonathan had said in his closing remarks to the city council. As he walked through his neighborhood that evening, greeting neighbors and feeling the genuine warmth in their responses, he allowed himself to believe that change was not only possible but already underway.